So welcome to our opening panel this morning, Nuclear Weapons Impact on Racial Justice, Climate Disruption, and Economic Inequality, How They Degrade Our Social Order. This morning, we'll be hearing from two renowned professors in this area of study. We'll hear remarks first from Professor Yuki Miyamoto, and then from Professor Vincent Intondi. Then we'll be sending you all into random breakout groups for about 7 minutes to discuss a question we'll pose at the end of the two presentations. When you all come back from the breakout, we'd like to hear from many of the groups, and we'll have a short time for question and answer in that format. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Miyamoto. Yuki Miyamoto is a professor of ethics in the Department of Religious Studies at DePaul University, where she teaches nuclear ethics, environmental ethics, nuclear discourses in the US and Japan. She's published monographs Beyond the Mushroom Cloud in 2011, Naze Genbaku ga Aku Dewa Nankoka, The Narrative Divergence in the Nuclear Discourse in 2020, and A World Otherwise, Environmental Praxis in Myanmar in 2021, in addition to several articles focusing on gender in nuclear discourse. Her current work is to examine discrimination against the atomic bomb sufferers in Japan through the construction of post-war nuclear discourse in Japan. She has taken DePaul students to Hiroshima and Nagasaki since 2005 on the biannual study abroad program. So thank you for joining us this morning, Professor Miyamoto. I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for your introduction. And first of all, let me share my screen here. Okay, can you see my screen? And let me do a slideshow. Okay, is this okay? Good. Well, thank you very much for having me this morning. I'm very, very excited about this Chicago Area Peace Action, especially student-led Peace Summit 2022. This session is entitled Nuclear Weapons Impact on Racial Justice, Climate Disruption, and Economic Inequality, How They Degrade Our Social Order. And first of all, when we hear the term nuclear weapons, we may associate it with the fields of international relations, diplomatic concerns, national security. Nothing is wrong with that, but kind of concepts may not have to do with our everyday life. Today, I'd like to challenge that notion and to discuss how this matter of nuclear weapons are actually closely linked to or even intertwined with racial justice, environmental issues, and economic concerns. Thus, the biggest question for us is, in turn, why we do not think of nuclear weapons as the issues related race, climate, and economy. To that end, I would like to begin with this beautiful photo, which is a beach of Runit Island, a part of the Marshall Islands. It is gorgeous, especially, being in Chicago, we had a little snow yesterday. But how is this related to today's topic? Okay, the Marshall Islands are located in the Pacific and are constituted of several atolls. The concrete dome you saw in the picture beside the beach is called Runit Dome. Unlike the background of beautiful blue ocean, the dome contains 11,000 cubic yards of radioactive materials, up to 400 pounds of plutonium. And there are various radioactive nuclei whose half-life varies from a few days or a few hours even to days, weeks, and years. But the half-life of plutonium, which is said the most harmful to the human body, is 24,000 years. Until plutonium becomes completely, or nuclear waste becomes completely safe to the environment, it will take 100,000 years. And because of this radioactivity, the concrete of the dome is cracking. You may have seen the photos of Chernobyl reactor, which exploded and spewed radioactive materials in 1986, is now covered by sarcophagus, concrete containment. But it started cracking, and EU put money to build another layer of sarcophagus to cover it. Moreover, due to the climate change, the dome may submerge in the near future, and the massive amount of radioactive materials will be released into the ocean. This is definitely the environmental concern. But why? Why on earth does the Marshall Islands have this much amount of nuclear waste while they are not a nuclear country? The answer is nuclear tests. Do we know how many countries have conducted how many nuclear tests so far? You can just jump in or shout, but I will give you the smaller numbers. Here, sorry, I flipped the number on the first use, but you have some ideas here, right? So Pakistan did a nuclear test, the first nuclear test in 1998. And this is the number of the test, because this test has 6 nuclear weapons. However, only 2 went off. India in 1974, the first time, kind of against China. The second time was 1998. Yes, that's the same year as Pakistan did its first nuclear test. And actually, their nuclear tests were only 2 weeks apart. Next is North Korea. They might have done recently, but I have confirmed so far 6. And we were so concerned about this, right? But we have more countries have done. Let's see. China in 1965 for the first time, and 42. So you can see a jump of the numbers here. UK, 43. France, 212. And perhaps you might wonder, what are other countries which have done the nuclear tests? And of course, Soviet Union and the United States. So let's see those 2 countries. USSR, 714, and USA, 1,032. And the US conducted, among these 1,032, 67 nuclear tests between 1946 to 58 in the Marshall Islands. And it seems like it was a long time ago, but I would like to remind you how long some of the radioactive nuclides survive. And also you may wonder where we have tested over 2,000 nuclear tests altogether. So here you go. Do you see some common traits? The nuclear test sites are too often located in the former colonies like Algeria, in the African continent, or minorities residential areas like Nevada or the Pacific. So this is certainly a racial justice issue. And among those nuclear tests at the Marshall Islands, there was an operation called Project 4.1. And later, much later, after the series of nuclear tests had been done, the document was declassified. And we learned that one of the scientists who were involved in this operation, Merrill Eisenbad, he described the Marshallese as such. Even before the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, radiation experiments on human body have been executed. For example, this is from Medical Apartheid on the book, in the book on the left. For example, Eb Cade is an African-American male who became the subject of radiation experiments. While he was working for Oak Ridge Lab, he had an accident that fractured multiple bones, and he was diagnosed, or the doctor thought that he wouldn't live long, and that was why the experiment was done. But he actually survived for a while after the experiment. It's a horrific story if you are interested. And also Mormons, which is especially early in the 50s and 60s, they were kind of discriminated a Christian group. Mormons in Utah were affected from the atmospheric tests at Nevada test site, but some of them had been encouraged to move to Hanford nuclear site in Washington state. And Hanford is the place where produced plutonium for Nagasaki bomb. The site is known also to release radioactive gas as a part of experiment to the vicinity. And Mormons were not only discriminated against in those days, but also do not intake tobacco or no alcohol. So that made them in ideal subjects for the experiment. Other experiments were, for example, 102 students and staff members at the University of Chicago also became the subject by digesting the fallout from the nuclear tests. And in New Mexico, on top of the fallout from the Nevada test ground, many uranium mines were affected by radiation exposure. Now some areas, uranium miners were affected by radiation exposure. Now some areas are taking nuclear waste because they needed to create jobs in the area. So they have to choose between today's health or today's bread or future health. And that kind of choice shouldn't be imposed upon to begin with. So this is a map of RECAR, which is Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. That's a program and a federal program. And as the map shows, people in New Mexico do not receive any compensation from radioactive fallout of Nevada nuclear tests. Yellow is a compensation area for uranium workers. And the green is the one, blue and green are the ones for either both nuclear miners or downwinders from the nuclear test sites from Nevada. But as you see, the compensation areas were divided according to the state borders, as if the plume stopped over the state borders. And also, I like to remind ourselves that the first nuclear test was done on July 16, 1945, approximately 2 weeks before the Hiroshima bombing, Alamogordo, New Mexico. And actually, at this time, a number of 13-year-old girls were camping approximately 40 miles away from the nuclear test site. And they had fallout, radioactive fallout from the test, from this very first one. And somehow they didn't know, they were not informed. They thought it was snow, unseasonal snow. But because of that contact, only one among those survived before they turned to 30. All but one died from cancer. And good news here is that the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which came into effect last year, and it states clearly the consequences of the use of weapons leads to a disproportionate impact on women and girls. This is something also Congressman Garcia was talking about earlier in the video. So disproportionate impact on women and girls, in addition to their susceptibility to radiation exposure. Also, let us not forget how women have been used, not only to promote nuclear weapons, but also to give an image of manageability of it. So the message in the 50s especially was that, like women, when we treat nuclear weapons well, they are on our side. If we mistreat them, they will explode. So the city of Chicago is also making efforts. This is a legislation text submitted by Alderperson Maria Haddon of Chicago. It clearly states that owning nuclear weapons contribute to racial and economic inequalities. And for example, here, the second bullet point clearly states that this is a racial issue. And the third bullet point, this is an economic issue. So we must pay attention to how much money is spent to maintain the weapons at the expense of education and health of its citizens. Nuclear weapons do not pose a possible catastrophe. Actually, they are already having caused suffering in all over the United States and beyond. And I will take up St. Louis, just one of the examples among many, because St. Louis might be the closest to us in Chicago. St. Louis was the place where refined and enriched the uranium that came from Belgium, Congo, Canada, and Colorado. So already this Manhattan Project, which produced the Hiroshima Nagasaki bomb, heavily depended upon this colonial structure. The uranium became Hiroshima bomb here in St. Louis. However, unlike other facilities like Hanford, Los Alamos, and Oak Ridge, this is not a federal and military facility. This is a private company which was dealing with the uranium. So liability is a little more unclear, excuse me, obscure. So therefore, the nuclear waste that came from processing was all over, and especially went into this little river or creek called the Cold Water Creek. So unfortunately, this radioactive waste, which was left there, still affecting people to this day, over 70 years later. And this is a map of St. Louis, and the red dots are cancer cases. And you can see this is the Cold Water Creek that I was talking about. So given that, we needed to ask ourselves why we need to discuss nuclear weapons now. And because they are the issues of environmental justice, economic issues, gender issues, and the racial issues. Further, and it all shows that imperialism, militarism, and the colonial structure still persists. And further, we need to ask ourselves why the nuclear deterrence theory is persistent even today. The nuclear deterrence theory is that nuclear weapons protect us. Because we have nuclear weapons, we are saved, or we are safe. But is it really the case? As we have seen, what happened to those 1,032 nuclear tests, and what happened underneath the mushroom cloud? Well, some of them were done actually not only in atmospheric, but also under the ground, under the water, in the ocean. So massive environmental destruction there, as well as human bodies. So we have already distracted. So therefore, the next question is, the set of questions is that whose interests does this theory serve, or who is protected and who is not? And these questions will reveal structural violence, I hope. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, how and why is this violence detached from our everyday concerns as if it has nothing to do or less to do with environmental issues, economic issues, racial issues, gender issues. So this is the my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Miyamoto. So I just make a short comment, and then I'm going to introduce Vincent Intondi, Professor Intondi. But so often the conversation around nuclear weapons goes around, well, what if, right? What if by accident or by design or by escalation or miscalculation, we wind up with an exchange of strategic nuclear weapons and how horrific that would be. And Daniel Ellsberg will talk about the nuclear winter, which we didn't even know could happen until about 1968. And even in all those conversations, I think we sort of get lulled into a false sense of security that, well, we've had them for 75 years and we've never had a significant accident that actually occurred. And I think that what you just heard from Professor Miyamoto and what you'll hear certainly from Professor Intondi is that isn't even the worst part about it. The worst part about it is the ongoing daily degradation of all of these aspects of civil society that the mere existence of nuclear arsenals present. So without further conversation, Professor Vincent Intondi is a professor of history and director of the Institute for Race, Justice, and Civic Engagement at Montgomery College in Tacoma Park, Maryland. From 2009 to 2017, he was director of research for American University's Nuclear Studies Institute in Washington, D.C. Prior to teaching at Montgomery College, Intondi was an associate professor of history at Seminole State College in Sanford, Florida. He regularly works with organizations exploring ways to include more diverse voices in the nuclear disarmament movement, and Lord knows they are needed. His research focuses on the intersection of race and nuclear weapons, something we don't often hear about. He's the author of the book, African Americans Against the Bomb, Nuclear Weapons, Colonialism, and the Black Freedom Movement with Stanford University Press. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the students for organizing this. Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Dr. Miyamoto, that was a fantastic presentation. Hard to follow. I'm not sure if I even need to add anything because they hit it out of the park and mentioned everything so wonderfully. So let's see if I can complement that, and then we can have a nice, hopefully lively discussion in breakout rooms. So and maybe some of the younger folks will relate to this, but when I was younger, as an activist and as an academic, most of my research, most of what I was doing focused around the Black Freedom Movement and civil rights issues. Nuclear weapons wasn't really on my radar. I thought they were too abstract. So nobody would be crazy enough to use them, didn't really understand them. So it wasn't something that I was focused on. And that changed for me in 2005. That was the first time I went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and met with atomic bomb survivors and attended ceremonies, went to museums. And I was filled with so much rage and guilt and anger about what my country had done that when I came back, I realized that what I had to do now going forward was try to eliminate racism and eliminate nuclear weapons. And how do I go about doing that? And so the first question I asked was, what did African Americans think about dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And most people said I wasn't going to find much because African Americans were trying to gain their own freedom and equality, didn't have time to work on this issue. And that would be understandable, but they were wrong. And so one of the first stories that I found was in June of 1964, in which there was a group of Hiroshima survivors at a World Peace Study mission. And when they came to the United States, Yuri Kachiyama, the amazing Japanese-American activist, organized their visit. And she said to them, when you're here, what is it that you want to do most? And they all answered, meet Malcolm X. But Malcolm was traveling throughout the Middle East and Africa, and she was very good friends with Malcolm. And so she wrote letters to him. I'm not thinking that he ever received them. On the last day, she was having a reception at her place in Harlem, her apartment in Harlem, and there was a knock at the door. And when she opened the door, there was Malcolm. He came back. And Malcolm said to the atomic bomb survivors, the bomb that hit you was the atomic bomb, and the bomb that hit us was racism. And he spent the day talking about Vietnam and colonialism and nuclear weapons and racism, because he understood what so many before him understood, that these issues were not about civil rights, it was human rights. He understood how these things were inextricably linked. So this book that I wrote, and much of the early research I did, focused on the intersection of race and nuclear weapons, and looks at those Black activists that constantly argued that liberation movements around the world, nuclear disarmament, and civil rights were all links in the same chain. Now, when the atomic bomb was dropped in August of 1945, Gallup ran a poll in the United States a week after the atomic bombings in which 85% of the American public agreed with Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons. In fact, Roper had a poll in the same week that showed that 22.5% of the American public wished Japan hadn't surrendered, so we could have dropped more nuclear weapons and killed more people. And no poll up until late October of 1945 ever showed more than 4.5% of the American public questioning Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons. But that wasn't the case in the Black community. Now, nothing, of course, is monolithic, but inside the Black community, there were artists, musicians, poets, writers, pastors, singers that were speaking out against Truman's decision and that were looking at this from a different point of view. And that is because why was there such a reaction like this in the United States with the general American public? Because there was a genocidal race hatred against the people of Japan that is unprecedented, worse than even the hatred against people of Middle Eastern descent after 9/11. Everywhere that you looked in the media in World War II after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese were considered roaches and yellow vermin and monkeys. And why? Because if you make them less than human, it is easier to commit violence against them. And we didn't do this with Germans. We separate Germans from Nazis, fascists from Italians, but not Japan. They were all guilty. And so General Joseph Stillwell wrote to his wife, quote, "When I think about these bow-legged cockroaches that have ruined our calm lives, it makes me want to wrap Jap guts around every lamppost in Asia." The motto of the Marines at the time was remember Pearl Harbor, keep them dying. And so to really put this in context, you have to go back to slavery. This is what we did with Africans when we kidnapped them and brought them here. Because if you are going to kidnap millions of people against their will, and you are going to bring them here now, and for hundreds of years, you are going to castrate them, beat them, burn them alive, kill them, treat them as chattel, all for the sole purpose of making millions and millions of dollars in this economic system, you cannot do it if they are human beings. They have to be something less than human. So we make them an other. We make them subhuman. We say they're not Christian, they're not civilized, they are biologically inferior to us. And we do this again when we make the leap from undocumented immigrants to calling them aliens. The translation is not fully human, and it makes it easier to say put them in cages because they're not human. What are the images they show us in the Middle East? As someone who is screaming Allah Akbar, some bombastic image, and they don't look like us or talk like us or act like us or smell like us. Translation is they're not truly one of us, so it's easier to commit violence against them. And even as we are so desperately hoping that this nightmare in Ukraine will end, we cannot ignore how this has been racialized, whether it's through Putin's language and how he talks about the Ukrainian people, or how the media has talked about Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and other places where it's predominantly people of color, as somehow they being less worthy of our help. So this is not new. But again, in the Black community, this wasn't the case. And part of that was because there was an affinity already built in. Because when Pearl Harbor happened, it was the Japanese who publicly came out and said they were going to come to the aid of their colored brothers and sisters when Ethiopia was being attacked in 1935 by the Italians. When Japanese internment happened, there were many in the Black community that looked and said, here's a group of people that are being put in these outdoor prisons, not for any crime they committed, but simply what they look like. This can happen to us, and we're actually sneaking food and clothes into those internment camps. So some of this affinity was already built in. And so if you look immediately following the atomic bombings in the Black press, like the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American, you will see a common thread of being critical of Truman's decision. If we look at letters to the editor in those newspapers, the same thing. If you look at what Black pastors were saying at that time, again, they were saying we don't have enough religion to fight this. This genie has been let out of the bottle. And the first person to publicly come out and criticize and ask if Truman's own deep-seated racism played a role in this decision was Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was writing in the Chicago Defender and said, why did we not drop this on Italy? Why did we not drop this on Germany? Was Truman's racism part of this? And he was right to do so. Truman's not the most racist president we ever had. We may have just finished that in the last 4 years, but he certainly was one of them, right? Truman, if you go back and look at letters to his wife, Bess, or any of his personal diaries, he rarely ever refers to African Americans as anything other than the N-word. In fact, in one letter, he admits that Black people he thinks God made out of mud and they should be in Africa, yellow people in Asia, and white people in Europe and America and admits that he's race prejudiced. He brags in interviews that when you got married in his family, you got slaves as wedding presents to start off the housekeeping with. His mother openly supported the Confederacy, and when she visited him at the White House, said she'd rather sleep on the floor than ever step foot in Lincoln's bedroom. In fact, at one point, he even sent a $10 check to join the Ku Klux Klan, but they sent it back to him because he refused to fire some of his Catholic workers in a business in Missouri. So there's no question that race played a role in this decision to use nuclear weapons in Japan. And so some of the earliest criticism also came from the Black Popular Front with the great W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. Piggybacking off of what Yuki had talked about, there was a rally in June of 1947 in Madison Square Garden in which 20,000 people were there. And Paul Robeson asked the crowd, where do you think the United States is getting the uranium to build nuclear weapons? And the answer, of course, was the Belgian-controlled Congo. So he went right after that colonialism issue. And a lot of this initial criticism fell mute in the early 50s with the rise of McCarthyism and HUAC and the Truman Doctrine. Long before George W. Bush ever said it, it was Truman who put that line in the sand and said, you're either with us or against us. And one of the worst things you could be was to be labeled black and red. But we also had the Korean War happening. The hydrogen bomb was now developed. And there were those in the Black community that said, we're not going to look at Korea as being another Hiroshima. We're not going to allow another people of color to be victims of nuclear weapons. And so they started out of Stockholm, the Ban the Bomb Pledge and the Stockholm Peace Appeal. And those in the Black community signed this, 2.5 million people. People like Charlie Parker, people like Marian Anderson and Duke Ellington were signing this petition. And on the heels of the civil rights movement, to see this many people in the Black community coming out against nuclear weapons is extraordinary. And when you look at the 1950s, it's such a critical time on this front, because, you know, in 1955, you have the heinous murder of Emmett Till. And a few months later in December, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on the bus. But also in that critical year of 1955 was the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, the first all-African Asian conference, in which they were talking about the connections of colonialism and nuclear weapons and white supremacy. And many in the Black community knew about that, were either attending or sending their regards. And at the same time, again, as Yuki showed, when you see nuclear testing coming up and how it affects people of color, whether it's Australian Aborigines or French Polynesia, the Marshall Islands, whether it's Native Americans, whether it's African Americans who were used as guinea pigs, veterans that were tested on. We see this, Kazakhstan, over and over, we see people of color being the victims here. And this was no different in the late 50s, during the Algerian War for independence, when you had Kwame Nkrumah and Ghana getting their independence. It was the French wanting to be a nuclear power who said they were going to test their first nuclear weapon, as Yuki showed, in the Sahara. And there was one person who saw the nuclear weapons issue in Africa because the people in Ghana feared what the fallout would do of that test to the cocoa industry, which was so vital to them, and saw what was happening here with civil rights and put it all together. And that was the great Bayard Rustin. But Bayard Rustin, a lot of young students, you don't learn about Bayard Rustin because he was openly gay. And so he's marginalized and iced out of the movement. And we don't talk about this amazing organizer. And Rustin puts a team of activists together to go to France, or to go to the Sahara, to go to Africa with Nkrumah to try to stop the French test. Literally puts his body on the line, and the French military has to remove him to test their nuclear weapon. And of course, I can't talk about the civil rights movement without talking about Dr. King, who many look at April 4th, 1967 is when he really jumped into the foreign policy issue. His famous speech at Riverside Church, Beyond Vietnam, when he calls the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. But actually, he was talking about the nuclear issue a decade before. As early as 1957, he was speaking out against nuclear weapons. He connected these issues. He talks about the triple evils of militarism, racism, and capitalism. You know, he would say to kids at Spelman and to other organizations he was speaking at, what does it matter if we integrate lunch counters and then not worry about the world in which we're integrating? That makes no sense if we achieve all of the social justice we're fighting for, and then we're all dead from nuclear war. That makes no sense. And he was learning a lot of this from his wife, Coretta. Coretta Scott King had been a long seasoned activist dating back to her days at Antioch College. She had been involved in Women's Strike for Peace, Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, and other women, of course, as well in the civil rights movement in this era. People like Lorraine Hansberry, who we know for A Raisin in the Sun, but was so much more than that, a feminist, a socialist, an anti-nuclear activist. Her last play was about a nuclear holocaust and what happened to the survivors. So there's so much rich history in the Black community that we completely ignore. You know, you have to remember that in terms of Black history, that in studying Black history, which is completely under attack right now in our country, that for so long, this history, the narrative, was written by rich, white, racist men. And so it's only since the Black Studies movement, the Black Arts movement in the late 1960s, people like Amiri Baraka and Sonia Sanchez and Nikki Giovanni, people like this that were students like yourselves demanding that this history be taught from this point of view. And that's when we see the rise of Chicano studies and Latin American studies and Native American studies and Black studies. So it's really a giant brick wall. And we're still filling in and trying to complete that narrative. When it came to the nuclear issue, there was still a giant brick missing that needed to be filled in. And so when you look at even the 1960s with Vietnam, here we are again with the people of color, and we're threatening to use nuclear weapons on them, right? Groups like the Black Panther Party were speaking out about this. Executive mandate #1 of the Black Panther Party specifically ties together the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the Black freedom movement in the United States. You know, I'm so happy that we have more socially conscious athletes today, whether it's Kaepernick or whether it's LeBron James when Trayvon Martin was murdered. There's so many, Dwayne Wade, we see so many, Serena Williams, socially conscious athletes. And when we think of socially conscious athletes, we think of course, Muhammad Ali. We think of the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City with John Carlos and Tommy Smith raising their fists in the air. But in the 1980s, there was another group called Athletes United for Peace. Russian athletes and American athletes joining together to try to stop nuclear war and the arms race. African-American athletes like JoJo Washington of the Boston Celtics, or Marianne Washington, the first African-American woman on the US national women's basketball team. The whole Baltimore Orioles baseball team went and traveled to Hiroshima. And so this really all is culminating in the 1980s, because when Reagan comes in, he increases military spending by $180 billion, slashes social spending by $140 billion, announces he wants to build the MX missile and increase nuclear weapons. And so this really wakes up a sleeping giant in the 80s. And so it comes from all different areas. It comes from athletes, and it comes from the Black community, because this is when they see the economic conversion piece. They're saying, how can we spend billions of dollars on nuclear weapons when there are so many programs being cut that are hurting us in the 1980s, right? We see this today, and those connections need to be made. A couple of years ago in Baltimore, not far from where I am, they were asking the parents to bring in space heaters because their kids did not have heat in the public schools. And yet we're going to spend $1 trillion on nuclear weapons. That connection has to be made to those parents to let them know. And so we also look in the 1980s, the new book that I'm writing now that will be out later this year focuses on the June 12th, 1982 demonstration and rally, the largest single rally for anything in United States history, the largest peace rally in world history. Over 1 million people gathering on that day in Central Park, demanding an end to the nuclear arms race. And people don't realize how diverse it was. 50% of the leadership that day were African-American, led by the great Reverend Herbert Daughtry, the Black United Front, the Third World People's Coalition. Thousands of people of color coming out of Bed-Stuy and Harlem and Brooklyn saying no to nuclear weapons. The LGBTQ community were part of the main leadership of this. You had so many people coming from different areas that were marching and asking for an end to nuclear weapons. People like Rita Marley and Richie Havens and Ozzie Davis and Chaka Khan, and they were all on stage speaking about this issue. And it worked. It moved the needle on the Reagan administration and what they did with nuclear weapons. And so you also have to think about Black politicians. We saw Representative Garcia earlier, and Representative Garcia seems to be on the right side of these issues, but he is not the first person, especially not in your area. The great Harold Washington, who is somebody that President Obama looked up to. Harold Washington, as your first Black mayor of Chicago, somebody who was also a congressman, he won awards for his work in the nuclear disarmament field. It was Mayor Washington, Harold Washington, who railed against the nuclear power industry because in 1983, your state, the state of Illinois, had more nuclear power plants than any other state in the nation. People like Ron Dellums and the Congressional Black Caucus, they were at the forefront of this issue. Ron Dellums went to Utah to meet with Spencer Kimball, the head of the Mormon Church, to make him come out against Reagan having the MX missile program in Utah. So we've seen Jesse Jackson, when he ran for president in 84 and 88 in the primaries, his platform was far more anti-nuclear than anybody in the Democratic field, right? And we also, of course, have Obama. And Obama, as a senator and as president, talked about being against nuclear weapons, for nuclear disarmament. He gave the Prague speech right after he was president, which is probably the most anti-nuclear speech any president has given outside of John F. Kennedy's commencement address at American University in June of 1963. He had the New START Treaty. He got the nuclear summit to try to get loose nuclear weapons making materials out of harmful hands. Symbolically, I think it was incredibly important that he was the first sitting president to visit Hiroshima. I will never forget, with the time difference being up at 4 or 5 in the morning with atomic bomb survivors on Skype crying because our sitting president was at Hiroshima. And the most important thing I think he did as president was, without firing a shot, getting Iran to give up their nuclear weapons program, which of course Trump destroyed. Now, does that mean Obama did everything I wanted? Of course not. When he left office, he still had the $1 trillion modernization plan on the table. He didn't take nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert. He didn't take off no first use or sole authority. But I don't put that on Obama. I put that on us, because he never said, yes, I can. He said, yes, we can. And if we wanted him to act, then we should have been 1 million plus strong back in the streets, pushing him and making him act and do what we said. And so it has been difficult in the last 4 years, right, to have Trump and Putin, two white nationalist, fascist dictators with 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal, and to not feel like we are maybe failing, right? But then you look at what Yuki said, which is the TPNW on the other side. Over 120 nations, mostly from the global south, saying no to nuclear weapons, no to financing them, no to transporting them. And that's incredible. And if you just want to see that relationship with race, I mean, just look at that juxtaposition, right? And so when we look at this issue, we need, of course, to focus on intersectionality. And we need to focus on making sure that undocumented immigrants and women and the LGBTQ community are treated equally. We need to make sure that Black Lives Matter, of course, matter. But again, what King said, none of this matters if we're all dead from nuclear war. And so the reality is, nuclear weapons and racism are probably still going to be in this world when I leave, or when we all leave, right? But if it's just a little bit less of both when we leave, that's all we can do, right? We're not fighting. I'm not fighting for the now. I'm fighting for the future generation, for the kids on this call and for their kids on this call. I'm often reminded of Rebecca Solnit, who said, the true impact of our activism may not be felt for a generation, but that is not the reason to fall into despair. That is the reason to be active. And so King would often say that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But I would argue not unless everybody on this call grabs it and actually bends it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that in mind, let's go for about 6 minutes into breakouts. And I think the question is almost self-evident. So what did you learn about the wider implications of nuclear weapons policy in these, albeit short presentations today, but powerful presentations? And what do you think the next step action should be? So let's go into breakouts for about 6 minutes. We'll come back and we'll talk for a few more minutes after that about what the next steps are. And we will answer all of those questions about getting everybody links to all of this information. We'll do that after the conference. Thanks. So we unfortunately only have about four more minutes, or maybe 5 more minutes. I just want to throw the floor open to folks who want to just raise a hand, or and Charles, can you call? I can't see everybody because I'm spotlit. No, I can see everybody now. If you'd like to raise a hand, say what you guys talked about, what you're thinking. We can hear probably from a couple of people. Jump in. Just unmute yourself and jump in.
Of course, we're going to stop nuclear, but so what if we've got a huge barrage of other armaments?
I think that's absolutely fair, but I will leave it to one of the speakers to talk about the overall militaristic bent of U.S. foreign policy.
Well, I think that's so true that, it's not just nuclear weapons we needed to get rid of. So thank you for your comments. Definitely. One thing which, and this is also, again, not just nuclear weapons, other chemical weapons as well, that last long and damage the environment, which means also affects the human bodies as well. But as I said, radiation also, we have to think about its long-term effects. We are already harming the future generations. So that's also, we might want to think about, including chemical weapons and biological weapons as well. So thank you again for your comment.
What does it mean if the economic system is dependent on warfare and weapons production?
Yeah, so there's two things I'll jump in here. One is I do understand, obviously, the fight against the military industrial complex and war in a general sense. I do put nuclear weapons in a separate category. Nuclear weapons and climate change, to me, are the two things that can eliminate us as a species. And nuclear weapons are, to me, unlike any other weapon that is out there, period. We're seeing such horrific devastation and war crimes in Ukraine right now. If he decided to start dropping nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it would be on another level. It's completely different. So I do think it's important, why we're focusing on everything to really, for me to go on the nuclear front, and also because it affects so many other things as well that we've obviously touched on and talked about here. As far as the second point that I heard somebody mention about the kind of the economic piece of this, yes, it's a great point. I remember when the book first came out and I was on a book tour and I gave a talk in upstate New York. And when I gave the talk, a lot of people in the crowd said they were absolutely agreed with me that nuclear weapons were abhorrent and they wish they didn't exist. However, the main employer in Syracuse, New York is Lockheed Martin, and they're making bombs. So their thing was, find me another job. And I'll happily, this was just a jobs program for them. 9 Mile 2 power plant, same thing right there. So the congressman there is not going to go against it because he's going to fear eliminating jobs. He's going to go to his district and say, I'm going to keep jobs going, right? So it plays into a jobs program, which you mentioned the economic issue. And you have a nuclear lobby, right? Where you have Boeing right there. I mean, look at what Biden just proposed. I mean, as far as military spending just on nuclear weapons would be the most we've ever spent in one single year on nuclear weapons. It's more than Trump. So this is something that obviously, we have to address on multiple fronts.
One point about your comment on nuclear weapons being used in Ukraine, it's not Ukraine that they're aimed at. It's European countries in NATO and the United States, which is responsible for the pushing NATO and its policy decisions, which moved it to the Russian border and have, for the last 50 years, been working to undermine Russia. And there are legitimate fears about what this country is capable of doing to advance an economic ideology, which you can track all over the Middle East and elsewhere.
I'll just jump in here. I get that, Dale. I understand the argument of NATO since 1989, 90, grabbing more countries and getting closer and so on and so forth. I understand that argument, but at this point in time, me personally, I reject it.
Well, it doesn't matter whether you reject it. Putin has already made clear that the United States is also in the target list if he has to use nuclear weapons, because the United States is the dominant force behind the other interests on this planet that have surrounded Russia. Whether you like Russia or not, I'm not saying that it's a good society or a bad society. They have a long history, a long culture of being an empire and a contributor to life on this planet in over hundreds of years, much longer than the United States. The United States is dominated by savage capitalism, and its empire is openly declares it wants global, unlimited domination of the planet. Full spectrum domination is the way it was worded in I think it was their 2020 nuclear or space report.
Earlier than that, full spectrum dominance was talked about probably during the.
Yeah, which is something you're not taking into consideration. In 1994, the Budapest Agreement between Boris Yeltsin and whoever was president of Ukraine at the time, I don't remember his name offhand. Ukraine was to hand over their nuclear weapons to Russia. They had about 40% of the world's nuclear arsenal was in Ukraine at the time. In exchange, Russia was to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. In 2014, when Putin invaded Ukraine, he violated that agreement.
Yeah.
Without question. I'm
Any
sorry.
other agreements been violated by?
I'm sorry,
11
sorry,
I'm
folks.
sorry,
This
it's
is
11:07, you guys. We're gonna be going into panels in about 3 minutes. So let me thank so much. We need to do this again sometime, maybe when the new book comes out, Dr. Intondi. Hopefully you'll be on a tour and we'll be able to get you in person. Yuki, we have you right here in Chicago. We'll talk about maybe getting something together this summer so that we can get together live and in person. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The last thing I want to say is that tomorrow, April 4th, is the whatever, I'm sorry, I don't have the number of years directly in my head, the 55th anniversary of Martin Luther King's fabulous Riverside Church speech. If you Google Beyond Vietnam, Martin Luther King, you'll find a text of it. I would encourage everybody to just take about 20 minutes. It's about a 20-minute read. Sit down calmly, quietly, before you do anything else in your day. Reread that speech. It is powerful, and it could have been given yesterday. So thank you so much, Dr. Intondi and Dr. Miyamoto. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.